Hello. So we're going to talk about chapter 11 and chapter 12 and chapter 13. Sorry. So we'll do the autonomic nervous system and we'll probably add the endocrine system as well. Okay. The ANS is pretty short. So that's why I decided to add both of them together in one video. So let's get started. We're in chapter 11, section 1. Um, the autonomic nervous system is part of the nervous system that regulates the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, and certain glands. It does usually operate without conscious control, so that means we don't always have to tell it to do it. So, for example, think of our cardiac muscles or think of the heart. We don't have to tell our heart all the time to pump. The autonomic nervous system automatically makes it pump or makes it work. But it's also regulated by other brain regions, like we talked in the earlier video such as the hypothalamus and the brain stem. Then on the other hand, we have the somatic nervous system. Somatic, so soul body. That includes sensory and motor neurons. So the sensory neurons input, so they get input from receptors for special senses, such as vision, hearing, taste, smell, and equilibrium, and from the body senses as well. So everyone else in the body, like pain, temperature, touch, proprioceptive sensations as well. Okay. So that's the difference. ANS is kind of like involuntary. The somatic SNS is voluntary. Okay. So the automatic motor neurons regulate activities in their effectors. So effectors are the ones that receive the signals. So the effector tissues, which are the cardiac and smooth muscle and some glands, by both exciting or inhibiting. So either they turn them on or they block them to not happen. Okay. So think about glands. Think about they have hormones. So you can either turn on the release of those hormones or block the release of those hormones. Okay. The output part has the two main branches, which is a sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And we'll talk a little bit about those. Most organs have dual innervation. That means they receive signals or impulses from both sympathetic and parasympathetic. It's just either one or the other at that time to either continue a process or stop a process. So either nerve impulses may stimulate the organs to increase its activity or decrease the activity. So excited or inhibited. Okay. So here's a couple of images of different pathways. So you can see the spinal cord here. See a signals being sent, and you have this somatic motor neuron that extends all the way out to the effector, or the one receiving it, which in this case is the skeletal muscle. On this next image, you have a signal, but then we have what's called the preganglionic neuron. So it's like the first neuron. So some of the motor neurons here. First neuron, the autonomic ganglion. So a little acetylcholine is released. Remember in our muscle contractions, acetylcholine released, and then the signals pass through, and then goes through the next, or the postganglionic neuron, and then it goes to the effector, which in this case either glands or the heart or smooth muscle in some of the organs or anything like that. On the other hand, we have a signal going through the preganglionic and through a gland. That gland will receive that signal, ACH or acetylcholine also released, and will send the hormones to either promote or inhibit, or excite or inhibit a certain action. So in this case, say epinephrine or norepinephrine is released. And then at the bottom, we have another signal as well. We have a longer preganglionic neuron and smaller parasympathetic or postganglionic neuron. So these are parasympathetic, so different function, but also depending on the effector that it goes to. Okay, so it's just different types of different ways of passing signals from the spinal cord to its main destination. Okay, so the top one was just somatic, so that's just the body. I remember it's just from the spinal cord to the muscle, skeletal muscle. The other three are different forms of autonomic nervous system signaling or passing on neurons to its effectors or wherever it needs to go. Okay, so here's a couple comparisons. So effectors, who receives them? So in the somatic nervous system, the skeletal muscles, and the autonomic is a cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, or the glands. The somatic is voluntary, so we tell our muscles to move, to work out, to lift weights, to do certain things, to walk. The autonomic system is involuntary. Okay, so the neural pathway, what the images we were looking at, one neuron extends directly to a skeletal muscle fiber, and the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, kind of in our muscular video from last week. Okay, action potentials. On the other hand, we have the autonomic nervous system, so it can extend from the CNS with other motor neurons in the ganglion, a second motor neuron synapses, and the neurotransmitters acetylcholine or norepinephrine. Okay, and the somatic nervous system. So the action or what happens to the effector or to who receives it, it's always going to be excitatory or exciting it or promoting or causing some sort of contraction to that muscle. On the other hand, the autonomic can either be promoting it, like a positive feedback, or inhibiting it, like a negative feedback. Okay, so it can continue that contraction of the muscle, increase heart rate, increase secretion of hormones, or it can block it, like relax those muscles or decrease the heart rate, stop producing those hormones. Okay, so those are the two differences between somatic and autonomic. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk about the two divisions. We have the sympathetic division, call it the thoracolumbar, because that's where most of the nerve impulses will go through, thorax and the lumbar, and the cell bodies of sympathetic preganglionic neurons are in the 12 thoracics or the lumbar segments. The sympathetic ganglia are classified as trunk ganglia or prevertebral ganglia. Okay, so a single axon. So we're talking about the autonomic nervous system here. May synapse with 20 or more post-ganglionic neurons. So remember in the picture, you have the pre and the post. So you have another neuron here on the right as well. You have that ganglion in the middle, kind of sending the signals, connecting the two, having that exchange of that neurotransmitter, and it connects to another neuron. Okay, so that's what it's saying. You can have 20 or more post-ganglionic neurons, so connect to other neurons as well. It can affect organs throughout the body almost simultaneously. So I can say different signals because it has so many connections or places to send that signal to, that it doesn't have to be just one to the muscle, just one simple signal. Okay. Right. So there's a couple of different pathways. So the signal or the preganglionic, it goes through the preganglionic neuron. It may synapse with postganglionic neurons. It may ascend or descend to like a different trunk or different part of the vertebrae or higher before going to other neurons. It may continue without synapsing through the ganglion, or it may terminate in the adrenal medulla or in those glands, adrenal glands. Okay, so here it is. So here's a picture of the sympathetic division. Okay, so it's gonna you have, if I can zoom in more, but signals can go through different areas. You can see on the top. Remember, this can be signals that can go to different parts of the head, go to the heart, cardiac plexus over here. We got the lungs, the liver, the gallbladder. So different neurons. See all these little channels, different connections, different pathways it can go through to get to where it's supposed to go. That's a sympathetic division. So to kind of like excite something, to turn something on by sending signals to it. Okay, and so this is just describing all the different types of pathways that can occur and connections with different neurons to send those signals. Okay. On the other hand, we have the parasympathetic division. So we have also called the craniosacral division, because most of those impulses come from the brain, the cranium, or the spinal cord. Okay, the parasympathetic ganglia or terminal ganglia are near the autonomic effectors, are close to the walls. So most of them are really short. So most of these signals or these axons are really short, but they also have a lot of connections as well. They can connect to different terminal ganglia in an organ, and they're longer. The preganglionic neurons are longer than the sympathetic preganglionic neurons. Okay, so here, let's get an image here as well. So now you see most of the signals are coming from the brain to the different sections where they're supposed to go. They're not really flowing through the vertebrae or through the thoracolumbar. So it's saying the other one, the thorax and the lumbar sections. Okay, so most of these signals, impulses are being sent through the brain stem or the spinal cord, parts of the brain to different parts of the face or the heart or other areas. Okay. Now, main functions of the autonomic nervous system. So the brain is going to release neurotransmitters. Okay, so these neurotransmitters are kind of what send those signals or turn on those signals in the certain areas. Remember in the image of our muscle, we had acetylcholine that would attach to a receptor in order to continue that signal to be sent through the muscle. Okay, so those are neurotransmitters. They're really fast, and they can go through different sections super quickly. So some release acetylcholine, some release norepinephrine, some may excite or continue a process, some may inhibit or block a process from happening. So the ANS neurons that release acetylcholine are all sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic neurons, all parasympathetic postganglionic neurons, and a few sympathetic postganglionic neurons. Okay, most sympathetic postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine. They are long-lasting or more widespread, so they last longer. So if you think a little bit about sending signals through, we want our signal to really be sent and reach longer places and where it's supposed to go, and last longer. So that's why or last longer and they're more widespread. Starting norepinephrine, the postganglionic or that second neuron connection. Okay. The activation of the sympathetic division releases hormones by the adrenal medullae. That's where we get our fight or flight from sympathetic, fight or flight, excitatory. Turn on those hormones. Let's go. Let's get going. Let's run. The parasympathetic is the one that controls the rest and digest. Okay. The parasympathetic response or supports body functions that conserve and restore the energy, while the sympathetic is the one that let's go, let's turn it on, let's get some energy, let's move those muscles. Okay, so here we got on the left different effectors or different. Remember, the effectors are the receiving areas or receiving sections. So in a sympathetic stimulation or a parasympathetic stimulation, what's going to happen with each one of these effectors or receptors. So, for example, sweat. We talk about sympathetic, fight or flight. You want to sweat. You want to run, and we start sweating. We start releasing those fluids, so we increase sweating. In parasympathetic, we're just going to rest and digest. You don't really sweat. Okay, so there's really no known effect. Tears, slight secretion in sympathetic, more secretion in parasympathetic. Adrenal medulla, so secrete or create epinephrine and norepinephrine. In the sympathetic, no known effect. The parasympathetic, in the pancreas. So during the sympathetic, remember it's the opposite as the para. Sympathetic, you're gonna inhibit or block the making of digestive enzymes and insulin. You're going to secrete glucagon, which raises the blood glucose levels and gives us more energy to fight or flight. On the other hand, in the parasympathetic, you're going to secrete or make digestive enzymes and insulin. Okay, so the opposites. In the pituitary gland, so you have in sympathetic, we're going to run, you have this anti-diuretic hormone or anti-water, basically anti-urine. So you're not going to produce urine, so you're going to hold urine a lot more because you're running. You don't really need to right now to get rid of it. On the liver or effect of the liver, when you're going to take flight, break down glycogen into glucose. You could synthesize or create new glucose and release that glucose into the blood and decrease the making or secretion of bile. On the other hand, the parasympathetic, the rest and digest, you promote the synthesis of glycogen and increase bile. For fat tissue, during the sympathetic, you're going to break down those triglycerides and release those fatty acids into the blood, trying to get some of that energy from those fatty acids. In parasympathetic, there's no effect. In the heart, increase heart rate. We're trying to flight or fight. In the parasympathetic, you decrease the heart rate and the force of contraction. Okay. Muscles of the eye. Sympathetic will have more dilation in the pupils. Parasympathetic, no effect. The muscle of the iris of the eye, no known effect. And parasympathetic, will have constriction of the pupils. Relaxation, contraction, the gallbladder. In the sympathetic, you're going to store the bile in the gallbladder. In the parasympathetic, the rest and digest, you're going to release that into the small intestine. And the stomach and intestines during sympathetic or fight or flight, you're going to decrease that movement of the stomach or the intestines, contract the sphincters and not work on that. On the other hand, the parasympathetic is going to increase that movement and relax those sphincters so you can start getting rid of that waste. The lungs, sympathetic, you're running, you widen the airways, bronchodilation, and in parasympathetic, you narrow the airways, bronchoconstriction. Okay. More examples. We got the urinary bladder, relaxation of the muscle wall, contraction of the internal sphincter. In parasympathetic, you're going to contract the wall and relax the sphincter. In the spleen, discharge of contracting discharge stored blood into general circulation. In the smooth muscle, get goosebumps from running or fighting. In the uterus, inhibit contraction or block the contractions in non-pregnant women or stimulate the contractions in pregnant women. Okay, depending what you need to do. And sex organs in men cause ejaculation. The parasympathetic has vasodilation, erection, clitoris, and penis in men and women. In the rest and digest. And salivary glands. While you're running or fighting, you're decreasing the making of saliva because you're not really breaking down any food or eating. You're not supposed to. And in parasympathetic, it's the other way around. You stimulate saliva. Okay. Again, gastric glands and sympathetic, you're gonna inhibit or block the making of those intestinal hormones, and in parasympathetic, you're gonna promote that creation. In the kidneys, you're gonna decrease urine, increase blood flow in the heart, and in the skeletal muscle. Okay. So that was it for chapter 12. Let's get into chapter. Let's go all the way to the top. Chapter 13, the endocrine system. Feel free to take a break if you like, a little bit to drink. All right, chapter 13, endocrine system. So it contains several glands or hormone secreting cells in the organs that have functions besides secreting those hormones. Okay, so on the other hand of the nervous system, which uses neurotransmitters, the endocrine system, or the cells of the endocrine glands, release hormones into the interstitial fluid, or the fluid around those cells, or even the bloodstream. So instead of using neurotransmitters, the endocrine system uses hormones. Okay, what's the difference? The neurotransmitters are quicker, send responses super fast to wherever they need to go because they have those channels or different connections of neurons and axons, um, and release those neurotransmitters super fast to send that signal where it needs to go. On the other hand, hormones are released slowly into the bloodstream or into the fluid, and eventually it's going to be an accumulation throughout a certain period of time. It's not like a quick release of that hormone. Um, so as our endocrine glands secrete their products into ducts that carry secretions into a body cavity and get rid of whatever. So that's exocrine, taking it out. So for example, sweat glands, example of exocrine glands, getting that sweat into those cavities and releasing it out. Okay, the endocrine glands include the pituitary, the thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, and pineal glands. So the main functions of the hormones that are created in those glands are to help regulate chemical composition, metabolism, contract the muscles or muscle fibers, secrete and help with immune activities. They can help control growth and development, like the human growth hormone or HGH, regulate reproductive systems, estrogen, testosterone, and help establish circadian rhythms. Okay, so that's what our hormones do. They're really basically going back to homeostasis and try to keep everything in balance and working. So here's just an image of the different glands or locations or certain areas that contain those glands. You have our thyroid gland over here on the top, kind of like right under Adam's apples in there. The parathyroid glands are kind of like little circles right behind the thyroid gland. The thymus, the heart, skin, the pituitary gland right here in the brain as well. Pineal gland, top left, kind of hypothalamus, on top of the pituitary gland, near the pituitary gland. The adrenal glands in the kidneys, as in the pancreas, the small intestine, and the reproductive organs. Okay. Now, differences between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So again, the nervous system uses neurotransmitters. The endocrine system uses hormones delivered through tissues throughout the body. So the nervous system has synapses, postsynaptic, presynaptic nerves or signals are sending through. The endocrine system, it's really far from it, so it's not just there. It binds to receptors, so they'll send the hormones, and the hormones will get to an area, and if that area or those cells have a receptor for that specific hormone, then the function will be completed, or the main purpose of that hormone will occur. But if those cells don't have the receptor, then it's not going to happen. It's not like neurotransmitter where they don't need to have a specific receptor to send those signals through. Hormones do need, or cells do need, specific hormone receptors. Types of targets of the nervous system, mainly muscles, muscle cells, gland cells, and other neurons. Endocrine system, mainly all cells throughout the whole body. How quick is it in the nervous system? The signaling with neurotransmitters is within milliseconds. In the endocrine system, seconds to hours a day. So there's an eventual accumulation of those hormones. Duration of action, it's really brief in the nervous system and a little longer in the endocrine system. Okay. So I was telling you, so hormones affect specific target cells that have those specific receptors to bind to that hormone. We have two types of hormones, lipid soluble and water soluble. So, for example, steroids are lipid soluble, and peptides or different proteins are water soluble. So, I'll show you a picture of how that works. Here it is. So remember, our layer is a phospholipid bilayer. So when it's lipid soluble, it can go through that phospholipid layer very easily. So when you send that hormone through, it's going to go through the layer into the cell, into the DNA, most likely, and um, change or alter gene expression to create specific proteins that are needed for that specific activity. So basically, in this image, you have here the hormone, which is lipid soluble. It can break through or pass through the lipid bilayers. It will diffuse into the cell, get into the nucleus, and then alter this gene expression. So you can have a transcription, translation. So it's going to alter that sequence, whatever the RNA is going to be, and then it's going to create the proteins that the hormone was telling the cell to create, because maybe those proteins are the ones that are needed to stop or to continue a certain function in the other parts of the body. Okay, so that's lipid soluble. It can really go through the layer, through the phospholipid bilayer, and alter the gene sequence and create specific proteins that are needed. Water soluble, on the other hand, it can go through the layer, so you need a receptor, you need a protein here to receive that hormone, and then we convert ATP into cyclic AMP. Um, and then with cyclic AMP, it's like a secondary messenger, certain proteins, so it's going to activate proteins, um, and then the cyclic AMP is going to be inactivated. Okay, so it's a different process. Um, it's kind of like more messaging. The water soluble hormone doesn't just go through and do what it wants to do. It really just stops there in that protein that receives it and converts energy into cyclic AMP, which will be a second messenger to send the signals to fix or create specific proteins, and then cyclic AMP is inactivated. Okay, so let's start talking about a couple different glands. The pituitary gland used to be thought of the master, but now we know that the hypothalamus has some control over the pituitary gland. There's the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Um, the hormones there are mainly controlled by inhibiting or blocking or releasing hormones produced by the hypothalamus. So there's hormones in the hypothalamus that are being created that are going to go to the pituitary and either block or continue or promote the production of hormone. So, for example, you got the human growth hormone, stimulates body growth through insulin-like growth factors. So basically, growth, what a lot of athletes take, HGH as well. And then also we have prolactin, so that initiates and maintains milk production and the mammary glands as well. So that's when a person's pregnant, and actually releases, I believe, oxytocin. That there's a study, I guess, that where people, moms that were giving birth and had two kids, the first one they immediately made it, put it to lactation, so they can continue releasing prolactin, which also helps promote contraction and release of the second baby, which is pretty cool. Also, in the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, we have the thyroid stimulating hormone. So it regulates the thyroid gland activities. So basically, it's going to be released to go into the thyroid. So from here, it's going to release to the thyroid to regulate the activities there in the thyroid for the next hormones that are created. Okay, so there's some hormones that are just messengers, and they're basically served to help other hormones be created or not created. We have the follicle stimulating hormone or the luteinizing hormone. It's basically the ovaries and the testes. We have the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is going to go and regulate activities in the adrenal cortex, adrenal glands, and other hormones. And then we have the melanocyte stimulating hormone. So they really don't know the main function of this hormone. They just know that an excess can cause darkening of the skin, but other functions are really unknown of that specific hormone. All right. So hormones made in the hypothalamus and released into the posterior pituitary gland. So an example is oxytocin. So I was telling you it stimulates the contraction of the uterus and ejection of milk from the breast. And the antidiuretic or anti-urine hormone, which stimulates water reabsorption by the kidneys, constriction of the arterioles. So yeah, oxytocin, as I was telling you about, stimulated by uterine stretching and by suckling during nursing, and the antidiuretic hormone is controlled by osmotic pressure in the blood and the blood volume. Okay. So here's an image: hypothalamus in their pituitary gland. Here's hypothalamus, posterior pituitary, anterior pituitary gland. So it's going to release the hormones, and they're basically going to go through here into the section or parts of the body where they also need to go. Here's a path of releasing. Let me see if I can show you. There it is. Send that signal, release that hormone to the section it needs to go. Okay. So here's also a live picture. Ooh, it's pretty cool. It looks like chicken. We got the pons right here. We got the midbrain over here. Pituitary, it's a little gland right here. The anterior pituitary, sphenoidal sinus, or the nose area right here as well. Okay. Go back. Right. So here's an example of how this hormone can be either released or controlled. So an example here is dehydration. So basically not enough water in our body. Okay. So there's increased blood osmotic pressure and decrease in volume. Okay. So our volume is going to get thinner and it's going to increase that pressure. The osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus will receive that information, activate the cells to create the ADH. Then the control center activate the nerve impulses that release that ADH from the posterior pituitary gland. So then the ADH will go in there into the kidneys and it'll tell it to retain water and decrease the urine output. Sweat glands also decrease that output. And then you have a decrease in blood pressure and an increase in volume. So you're going to stop producing or releasing the urine and the sweat, and release that pressure, the osmotic pressure, and increase the volume, and then go back to your balance, to your homeostasis. Okay. Now, on the other hand, when you have an excess of water intake, okay, so there's less pressure, but there's big volume. Okay, so what's that gonna do? Same thing. The osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are gonna block the cells that make the ADH. Okay, so basically it's gonna be blocked, and then it's gonna retain. The kidneys are gonna retain less water and increase the urine output. So get rid of that water because our pressure, our volume is too high, and our pressure is low. So then the pressure is going to increase a little bit and the volume is going to decrease and go back to normal again. All right. So here's a summary of those hormones. The HGH, or the growth hormone, it's going to stimulate the liver, muscle, cartilage, bone, other tissue, synthesize and secrete insulin-like growth factors, promote the growth of the cells, protein synthesis, tissue repair, breakdown of fats, increase blood glucose levels to get more energy. The thyroid stimulating hormone, it's going to go into the thyroid to help in that secretion or creating of hormones in the thyroid gland. The follicle stimulating hormone helps in creating oocytes and estrogen by the ovaries and stimulates the testes to make more sperm. The luteinizing hormone secretes estrogen and progesterone ovulation, and in males, it's going to produce testosterone. Okay. We have prolactin, milk production, ACTH, stimulates secretion of the glucocorticoids, and the melanocyte, the one that I was telling you about. We really don't know much, but we know that it can cause darkening of the skin. The oxytocin, contraction of smooth muscle in childbirth, and the antidiuretic hormone, so it conserves the water by decreasing, or anti-urine, decreasing the urine output. Okay. Now let's jump to the thyroid gland. So it has, it's right below the larynx. It's composed of the right and the left lobes. Thyroxine T4 and triiodothyronine T3, and parafollicular cells, which secrete calcitonin. Okay, calcitonin. So thyroid hormones basically regulate oxygen and our metabolic rate, metabolism, helping growth and development. Secretion is controlled by the TRH from the hypothalamus. Remember, our thyroid regulating hormone, and stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary that we got right here. So here's our stimulating hormone right there. Okay. Then calcitonin can lower the blood level of calcium. So secreting it is controlled by the level of calcium in the blood. This can also cause problems in the bones because of calcium in the bones. Okay. So here's a picture. Thyroid gland, the right lobe, the left lobe. Here's our trachea. Okay. So this is basically what it looks like. Here's a little cell, and inside you have those hormones that are there. So you can stimulate to release those hormones to where they need to go. Okay. So here's another example of that feedback loop. If the level of thyroid hormones is low, we need to control that. We need to fix that. It's carried into the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary will release the TSH, which will stimulate thyroid follicle cells to release those hormones into the effector or most of the cells in our body, and then that will increase metabolic rate and other actions as well. Okay, so it's all a little cycle. These are all basically negative feedbacks because you're blocking what's happening and trying to fix it, do something different. Right, so now let's get to the parathyroid glands. They're embedded on the posterior surface of the thyroid, regulate balance in calcium, magnesium, phosphate, and it's also controlled by the level of calcium in the blood. Okay. So those are thyroid, and here's the little parathyroid glands, the little green circles that are in there. Okay, here's a live image. Well, not live, but a real life image of a thyroid gland and the little sections of the parathyroid glands as well. Okay. So say you're trying to control the blood glucose levels to stimulate those cells, parafollicular cells in thyroid glands that will release more calcitonin to block the osteoclasts, which will decrease the blood calcium levels. Okay, yeah, so remember, these are the ones that are breaking down other cells. So, same thing, but now the opposite. So it's going to stimulate and release, chief cells release more parathyroid to stimulate the osteoclast or the bone cells that will increase the calcium levels. So we're going to break that down to increase calcium levels. So when this is not working, you now the osteoclasts are really doing too much of its job they're supposed to. Okay, we have what we call pancreatic islets or islets. Like it's kind of like island. Um, so the pancreas, uh, the endocrine portion has a pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans, which are basically made of alpha and beta cells. So the alpha cells will make or secrete glucagon. The beta cells will secrete insulin. Um, so glucagon increases blood glucose levels. Insulin decreases blood glucose levels. Okay, so secreting those hormones is controlled by the level of glucose of the blood. So if we have high blood glucose levels or low blood glucose levels, but it's on the pancreas where those cells will make that hormone. Okay. So here's a couple of examples. Here's a pancreas image of the pancreas, the duct, the duodenum. That's what we have. Here's an example of the islet surrounding it. Exocrine cells on the outside. Here the purple ones secrete the glucagon in there, and the beta cells will secrete the insulin as well. Okay, so feedback loop. Say your blood glucose levels are low. What's going to happen? You have receptors in the pancreas that will stimulate um, the um, the alpha cells. The alpha cells will secrete or make glucagon. Um, Glucagon promotes glycogen breakdown to make glucose, and then that will increase the blood glucose levels. So once we start breaking down um, glycogen, we'll get glucose. On the other hand, um, with insulin, when you have high blood glucose levels, you gotta turn on your beta cells, right? You gotta turn on your beta cells that make the insulin. So the insulin is what's gonna move the glucose into the cells, um, or breaking down and decrease the blood glucose levels. So you got both sides: low blood glucose, high blood glucose. Okay. All right. So we have two adrenal glands: the adrenal cortex and the inner adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex has three zones: the mineralocorticoids, the middle zone has the glucocorticoids, and the androgens. Okay, mineralocorticoids, like the word itself says it, minerals. So you got sodium, water reabsorption, potassium, the ions, so all the minerals in there. Okay, secretion is controlled by the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone pathway. So it's basically a pathway near the kidneys that are gonna either block or promote the aldosterone that's gonna be created. Okay. The glucocorticoids. So remember, those are in the middle zone. So the mineralocorticoids are in the top zone, the outer zone. The middle zone has the glucocorticoids. So they'll break down protein and triglycerides, form glucose, so make some glucose from what's around. They help in anti-inflammatory effects and depression of immune responses. So this is a big one when there's going to be like a organ transplant, and we don't want a big immune response or rejection from the other body, so they inject glucocorticoids to suppress that immune response or that initial fighting against that organ that's going to be donated. Okay. Androgen is the other one. So that's in the inner zone. Okay, so androgen stimulate growth of the pubic hairs, prepubertal growth spurt, and libido. Okay, the adrenal medulla consists of cells from the ANS, and it secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are pretty much released when we're stressed out. Kind of like now because we have a test this week. So here's our kidneys, and here are the adrenal glands right on top of them. Okay, right on top of them. Here's a picture of a section, the adrenal gland. Here's on the left we have the adrenal gland. and then we have the kidney on the bottom. So here in this inner zone, that's where it makes the androgens. The middle zone, the glucocorticoids, and the outer zone, the mineral corticoids. Okay, so those are the three sections in the cell. All right, another pathway. So blood volume and blood pressure. So this is the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone pathway that I was telling you about. So we got receptors, the kidney cells release the renin and forms inactive angiotensin. So it's not active. Angiotensin is not active there. The ACE is going to convert the inactive angiotensin into an active angiotensin. Okay, and then that's going to promote those cells of the adrenal cortex to release the aldosterone in there. Okay, let me find out. I got my notes right here. There's something I wanted to tell you guys. I don't forget. Maybe I'll remind you before the test in class. All right. Now we are with the ovaries and the testes. Okay, so the gonads are the organs that will produce the gametes, and the gonads will produce estrogen and progesterone and inhibin. Okay, so the female sex hormones will regulate the menstrual cycle, help maintain pregnancy, prepare the glands for lactation, and establish that feminine body shape. The male gonads, or the testes, will produce testosterone, which will regulate production of sperm, development and maintenance of masculine characteristics, such as this long mustache. I don't know, it may work, but I don't get a beard, I just get a mustache. And deepening of the voice, which probably didn't get either. But all right, so those are the two from the ovaries and testes, reproductive organs, hormones that are produced. We got the ovaries and the pineal gland. It's attached to the roof of the third ventricle in the brain, and it secretes melatonin, which helps us contribute and set a biological clock and go to sleep. So more melatonin is released during sleep and when it's dark. So that's why we're falling asleep every time the lights go off and it's starting to get dark. We get more drowsy because of that melatonin. Melatonin is being released. Okay, there are higher in levels in children and decline through adulthood. Maybe you've noticed that. You used to sleep more, also because you weren't in college back then. But you were younger. You used to sleep more than older. Okay, and then we got other organs as well. We have different organs that produce different hormones. Thymus, the GI tract, kidney, the heart, fat tissue, the placenta. I think here's some examples here of different types of hormones. So we got, for example, in the thymus, we have thymosin, so it promotes T cells, so it's immune response, and may retard the aging process. Okay, so we're not going to get old soon. In the GI tract, we got gastrin, or glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, or GIP, and secretin. So gastrin promotes gastric juice, increases movements of the stomach. GIP will stimulate release of insulin by the beta cells, and secretin will stimulate the making of that pancreatic juice and the bile. Okay, and we also have cholecystokinin, also stimulate pancreatic juice or the production of pancreatic juice and release bile from gallbladder. And this is why we feel full after eating That cholecystokinin, man. Always making me full. Can't eat more tacos. All right. Also in the kidneys, we have erythropoietin, which is going to increase the production of red blood cells. We have atrial natriuretic peptide, which will decrease the blood pressure. We'll talk about that later, and that's in the heart. Okay. In the fat tissue, we got leptin. It suppresses appetite and increase FSH and LH. In the placental, you have human chorionic gonadotropin, which will help stimulate the ovary to keep producing estrogen and progesterone during pregnancy. Now, we have what's called the stress response. I believe we're almost done. Yes, it's our last section. So you probably do have a stress response this week because we're getting a test. But it can be any disturbance, heat, cold, poisons from the environment, toxins by bacteria, heavy bleeding from a wound, a strong emotional reaction. So they may be pleasant or unpleasant, and varies in persons. I'm not too stressed out this week, but I know a lot of you probably are. So it can have really long-lasting effects if it's pretty big or unusual, and it triggers the stress response, which has an initial fight or flight response, and then a slow resistance, and eventually exhaustion. Okay, so the fight or flight, remember, by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, will mobilize our body to immediately make physical activity. When we're stressed out, try to do something. Brings out a lot of amounts of glucose and oxygen to the organs, the brain, the skeletal muscles, the heart. Think about what you have to do if you're going to fight or flight. So that's where a lot of glucose and oxygen are being sent to. The second part, or the second stage, is a resistance reaction. So it helps the body fight that stressor after the fight or flight response. So it helps us get through a stressful episode. Our body will relax, get back to normal. When they tell you, like, don't stress out, and that stresses you out more because they're telling you not to stress out, so you're probably more stressed out. But sometimes that resistance fails. And that's when you got exhaustion, where like your body already gave so many resources during the other stages that right here you're just gonna rest. You have to. So it's like an automatic resting stage that you're gonna have to. Prolonged exposure to high levels of cortisol and other hormones cause wasting of the muscles and suppression of the immune system. And that is all. So make sure you took some notes. Make sure you reread through the chapters in your textbook. And I'll see you in class. And good luck this week. If you have questions, feel free to write them down in a discussion post or send me a message. Adios.